Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Nargis Kasenova, and I'm a senior fellow at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this seminar, Regions and China's Belt and Road Initiative, that Davis Center co-runs together with the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. And as usual, I'll be co-moderating it with my colleague and partner in crime, James Evans. Last time we talked about Northern Europe's response to Belt and Road Initiative, and today we will shift the limelight to the other side of Eurasia, to East Asia. It will not be an exaggeration to say that this is the center stage of global geopolitics today. And to understand the very complex and fluid dynamics in the region, what is going on and what the future might hold, we invited Professor Takashi Shiraishi to share his knowledge and thoughts with us. Professor Shiraishi is Chancellor of the Prefectural University of Kumamoto and Professor Emeritus of Japan's National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, GRIPS. He previously served, among many other senior posts, as President of GRIPS, President of the Institute of Developing Economies, JETRO, and Risumikan University Professor. He is the author of many publications, books, and articles on Asian politics and Japan in Asia. And among his latest books, there is Maritime Asia versus Continental Asia, National Strategies in the Region of Change, the English version of which has just come out from Lynn Reiner Publishers. Professor Shiraishi, we're most honored to have you with us today. And without further ado, let me give the floor to you.
Well, thank you very much, Nargis, for inviting me to talk about the book, which was recently published in English translation. I must tell that the book in original Japanese version was already published in 2015. Oh yeah, sorry. Please show the slide. Yeah, this is the title of my book. Next slide, please. And this was based on the public lectures I gave in 2014. And it was a time when President Obama was still serving as president and calling for rebalancing or pivot and TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. And in China, Xi Jinping was elected as Secretary General of the party as well as chairman of the military commission towards the end of 2012 and elected a president in 2013. And he was started calling for a new model of major power relations with the United States, as well as one belt and one road. And I actually still insist on calling it OBOR rather than BRI, because if you look at the Chinese title, it's the same. So the precise translation is in fact OBOR rather than BRI. But in any event, in Japan, Mr. Abe came to power towards the end of 2012, and then 2013 established the National Security Secretariat. And when I was giving my public lectures, he was still working on the first ever national security strategy being formulated at the National Security Secretariat. Next, please. But it was already clear that the tension was mounting in East Asia. And I must say that there was the structural tension between the American-led security system, which is sometimes called US-led hub and spokes regional security system, and the global trade and investment system. And it was quite obvious that the more China rises, the more heightened the tension will be. And so I actually wanted to tell the public here in Japan that we should be prepared for a heightened tension between the US-led security system, in which Japan is an important part of, and the the global trade and investment system in which Japan has very important stakes in China itself. But at the same time, I wanted to remind the public that the future, the most important arena for this tension or for this rivalry between US and its allies and China will be Southeast Asia. And judging from the way in which Mr. Abe was already conducting his foreign policy and also looking at countries he was visiting in 2013 and 14, it was quite clear that the regional framework for this region was already shifting from Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific, even though Mr. Abe himself did not use the word Indo-Pacific until 2016. But it was quite clear that what he had in mind was this framework, which we now call Indo-Pacific. And therefore, I thought that this is a very important moment to redefine Japan's Asia policy, because it is no longer Asia Pacific, but rather Indo-Pacific, and in that case, actually engaging not only Southeast Asia, but also actually India would become very important. Next, please. So let me first talk about Southeast Asia, how important it is. It is quite clear that strategically, Southeast Asia is located right in the middle of Indo-Pacific. And actually, if you ask, who started to use the word Indo-Pacific in the first place, it was not Mr. Abe, it was not Australian prime ministers, but rather actually Indonesian President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, who used the word already in 2010. And I actually once asked, after he stepped down as president, I asked SBY, Mr. Yudhoyono, why he used the word Indo-Pacific instead of Asia-Pacific. And his answer was quite straightforward. Already ASEAN summit decided to invite Russia and the United States to East Asia Summit in 2010, and they will start attending the summit in 2011. And he thought that the more powers join this East Asia Summit, the less weight ASEAN will have. And therefore, just to remind the importance of Southeast Asia, he actually came up with the word Indo-Pacific, because once you look at Indo-Pacific as a region, Southeast Asia is right in the middle of this region. And if you look at economic size, even though ASEAN economies combined are a lot smaller than Chinese economy, and for that matter, even now smaller than Japanese economy, it is, at $3 trillion in 2019, which is about 3.5% of the global economy. It is as large as or a bit larger than Indian economy. And just for comparison, it is 10 times larger than 5 Central Asian economies combined, and 1.8 times larger than 13 new EU members which joined the EU in the 21st century. Next, please. So this map is borrowed from Australian white paper, and it's quite clear how strategic Southeast Asia is. Next, please. And this is just, showing the numbers, which I calculated from IMF data. If you put, the global economy at 100, United States is, of course, the largest, but Japan is still, Japan is still quite important, and Southeast Asia is actually 3.5% of the global economy. And actually, if you combine Indonesia and the Philippines and Vietnam, then actually it is as large as new EU members combined. Next, please. And so it's quite clear that Southeast Asia is strategically located, but at the same time, Southeast Asia is a region of middle and small powers. Population-wise, it is 47% of China's population in 2019, and about 1/5 of China's economy. But at the same time, if you look at military power, and if you look at military spending, as a proxy of military power, it is really minuscule. I will show later, but the largest, the country which spent the largest amount of money for military purposes is Singapore, and that is less than 5% of China's military spending. But at the same time, Southeast Asia is a region of emerging economies, and since the end of the East Asia crisis in 1997-98, Southeast Asia has been long on the growth path, and people there experienced rising income, rising standard of living, and therefore they now have a very high expectations for their future life. Next, please. So this is the comparison. Now, it's compared with China. In terms of population, it's 47%, and India 95% of China's population. In terms of GDP, it's 22% of China's GDP, while India is about 21%. But if you look at military spending, the Singaporean military spending is 4.3% of China's military spending. And even though both the Philippines and Vietnam are being confronted by the aggressive Chinese action in the South China Sea, their military spending is minuscule, really minuscule. In the case of the Philippines, 1.5% of China's military spending, and Vietnam, 2.2%. Next, please. But at the same time, as I said, they in fact experienced the very high economic growth. And this is just looking at the per capita GDP in constant prices and in their own national currencies over the last 20 years. Then Indonesia's per capita income doubled. And as well as the Philippines, as well as Vietnam per capita income. And in the case of Myanmar, it actually increased by more than 4 times, almost as good as China's performance. Next, please. So what is happening in Southeast Asia? First of all, if you look at security aspect, it's quite clear that Southeast Asian countries have diverging security interests. In the case of South China Sea, there are countries such as Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei, which have territorial conflicts with China. And even though Indonesia doesn't have a territorial conflict, it does have conflict over EEZ with China, while other 5 countries, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, and Singapore, have no territorial conflicts with China. Next, please. And also, if you look at the way in which they actually they come up with their own security policy, probably the most important factor is whether they build their own security policy with the American-led security system as given or not. And in the case of the Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore, Brunei, and Malaysia, and Thailand, it's quite clear they actually have their security policy with the US-led security system as given. While Vietnam, even though they are actually counting now on US and its allies, they are still a bit hesitant about entirely relying on this system for their security. And in the case of Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, they don't. Next, please. And if you look at their economic interests, again, Southeast Asian countries have diverging economic interests. On the one hand, it's quite clear that China is increasingly becoming important, not only as export markets, but also as sources of fund. China is now one of, for every country, China is one of the top 3 important markets. And if we look at their fund, it is not only OBO, but also direct investment. Now China is as important as Japan. But at the same time, if we look at the way or degree to which all these Southeast Asian countries are integrated to global economy, there is a clear difference. And one evidence, obvious evidence is the fact that there are 4 countries, Brunei, Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam, which are already part of TPP. And also, even though Thailand hasn't joined the TPP, Thailand, as well as Indonesia and the Philippines, are now pretty well integrated into regional supply chains. While, for example, Myanmar is not. And the same you can say to some extent to about Cambodia and Laos. Next, please. And this is, sorry, this is in Japanese, but this is how big each country's amount of loans and investment they owe to China compared with their annual budget. In the case of Laos and Cambodia, the loans, China's loans and investment are more than twice their annual budget. And in the case of Myanmar, also more than 150%. And Malaysia next, almost 90%, while other countries are not that dependent on China for sources of fund. Next, please. So these, given these conditions, it shouldn't be too surprising that ASEAN is now drifting. And this is, in fact, in sharp contrast with the ASEAN in the first decade of the 21st century. As you may recall, ASEAN was very important in the first decade of the 21st century because ASEAN served as the center for regional architecture, as you can see, such as in ASEAN plus 3, as well as ASEAN plus 6, which eventually evolved into ASEAN plus 8 and now called East Asia Summit, as well as ASEAN Regional Forum and so on. But already over the last 10 years, because of China's intervention, ASEAN can no longer maintain its integrity or its unity, and ASEAN has been drifting. And that is, of course, reinforced by their differing strategic interests among themselves. But at the same time, it is most important for them, for any country of ASEAN, to balance security and economic interest. They do not want to rely too heavily on China, but at the same time, they want to gain economically from China. And then what is the meaning of Quad? First of all, Quad has nothing to do with ASEAN, and precisely because it has nothing to do with ASEAN, but rather the region being defined by Quad is a region defined by 4 outside powers. it really undermines or threatens to undermine ASEAN centrality. And therefore, for all the members of Quad, that means the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, it is very important to uphold ASEAN centrality, even though we are very much aware that ASEAN is drifting. And at the same time, it is very important to engage individual ASEAN states. Next, please. Then what the Japanese government is doing. I mean, if we look at what Mr. Suga is doing over the last less than 1 year, I mean, since he came to power, I mean, already in October last year, the foreign ministers meeting of Quad was organized in Tokyo physically with American, Australian, and Indian foreign ministers. And right after the meeting, foreign ministers meeting of Quad, Mr. Suga visited Vietnam and Indonesia, and then concluded the MOU, I mean, Memorandum of Understanding, and as well as agreement for defense equipment transfer, as well as technology transfer with Vietnam and Indonesia. And this time, shortly after the Quad summit was organized online, and then Mr. Suga visited Washington, D.C. to see President Biden. He was planning to visit the Philippines and India, even though it was postponed because of the fourth wave of COVID crisis here. But in any event, it clearly shows that the Japanese government, whether under Mr. Abe or under the current Mr. Suga, they are really putting a lot of emphasis on enhancing cooperation for maritime security with Vietnam, the Philippines, and Indonesia. And also they are talking about the reorganizing supply chains. That means at least providing government support for companies to move their production facilities from China to these countries. But at the same time, and this is not quite clear whether the Japanese government is now doing, but at least I would argue that engaging Thailand and Myanmar are very important. I mean, if you look at Thailand, it's actually a quite interesting case. I mean, Thailand is one of the countries with no territorial conflicts with China. And it is, at least on paper, an ally of the United States. And it is a hub, economic hub of mainland Southeast Asia. And therefore, and also it actually serves as a host country of the most important areas for Japanese investment. And at the same time, Thailand is one of the major destinations of Chinese tourists. And therefore, Thailand actually is in very benign external environment. And I would say that this has allowed Thailand to drift politically for more than 10 years, almost 15 years. And in the meantime, actually, the internal division of Thailand has already shifted from the yellow versus red. That means based on regional income disparity, I mean, or income disparity between Bangkok and Northeast and North Thailand, to generational division. And we need to watch this division, I mean, how to develop division politically. And given the fact that monarchy is becoming pretty much not only authoritarian, but also absolutist, we need to be very attentive to the future development in Thailand. And at the same time, as you all know, Myanmar had experienced a coup about 3 months ago, but it is not clear where Myanmar is heading. But at the same time, it is quite clear that if you impose too much sanctions on Myanmar, and then probably Min Aung Hlaing will be prepared to go back, like Tan Shwe, to isolate military rule, at least for quite some time. And the point is, if you look at Maritime and Mainland Southeast Asia, there is now, you can clearly see a divergent way in which these countries are moving. Maritime Southeast Asian countries are moving in cooperation, quietly, even though they wouldn't say openly, quietly collaborating with the United States, Japan, and Australia, and maybe India, while in mainland Southeast Asia, all the mainland states are now authoritarian, and at the same time, geopolitically, Thailand and Myanmar occupy very important strategic locations. And therefore, it is important to seize opportunities whenever those opportunities arise for democratization, and actually make sure that mainland Southeast Asian countries, at least part of them, will eventually become democratic and open. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Shiraishi. Let me start with two very big picture questions. In the book, you discuss the window of strategic opportunity for China.
Yeah.
So is it closing in your view? And what's the place of BRI in it? Is it expanding this window of opportunity or not? That would be the first question. And the second question, what would be the smart policy for the US to kind of to operate, to engage in Southeast Asia? You already mentioned upholding ASEAN centrality. Is there anything else you would advise the Biden administration? And also maybe if you can address a little bit this kind of new ideological competition that is emerging. We hear more and more about, China being a systemic rival, about this kind of the struggle between democracies and autocracies. And yeah, what's your take on it? So actually three big questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I mean, first of all, I'm talking about the window of opportunity China has in this decade and probably next decade. But I would say, I would give at most 20 years simply because of the demography. If you look at the Chinese population as well as the ratio of senior people like me in China's population, the labor population has already peaked, and China's population will be peaking very soon. And by 2040, China will be in a position to support probably 25 to 30% of its population who are above 65 years old. And so, just, maintain its regime, you have to spend a lot for social security. And in fact, I'm curious, what is going to happen to China's medical expenses, because last year, because of Wuhan crisis, they actually decided to fund those people, for free. And that will eventually weigh a lot on their budget too. So, certainly Chinese government will do whatever they can, for example, to extend their retirement age from 60 to 65 and maybe 70 and so on. But I would say that, this demographic change will be weighing very heavily. And if they want to spend, money on sort of what you call it, 20th century weapon system, let them. That actually probably hasten this decline path. Hasten the closure of this window. That is my reaction to your first question. Second, what about US policy? I mean, it's quite clear if you look at what Biden administration has been doing over the last 3 months, that this is pivot, but pivot in a more sort of very well-focused way. It's no longer actually Asia-Pacific or Asian pivot, but rather I would say Japan pivot. And therefore, I mean, actually US and Japan should work together with Australia and if possible, India too. But the way it is not engaging ASEAN itself. I mean, it is important to uphold the centrality of ASEAN because this is a kind of, what I would call Buddhist mantra. I mean, Buddhist mantra is very important, and therefore you always say like this. But at the same time, I mean, this doesn't help much. So I'm sorry to say this. So you always formally uphold the centrality, but at the same time, now we need to engage individual countries. And in the case of maritime security, it is very important to engage Vietnam, the South China Sea issues. It is important to engage Vietnam, the Philippines, and Indonesia. And their capability for maritime security, that means not only Navy, but also the Coast Guard should be upgraded. And while I wouldn't say that mainland Southeast Asia, as I said, is also important, but given the political stability on Vietnam, I wouldn't touch on that. But rather, we should be very attentive to the developments both in Thailand and Myanmar. And if I want to be very frank, I mean, actually, I'm a bit worried about American opinion becoming too hasty to impose sanctions on Myanmar. I mean, we all know that, sanctions didn't work over the last 20, from 1980s to 2010 under Tan Shui. I mean, they took the second generation of military officers took over Myanmar's power, and then they stayed there. And even though they didn't like it, they became very dependent on China. And now, I mean, if you impose sanctions which we know wouldn't work, then the Min Aung Hlaing and his generation of officers will again has no other choice but to be dependent on China. Rather, actually, at some point, I mean, I expect that either this generation of officers, but at the latest, next generation officers will opt for, again, an attempt to not exactly democratize, but rather transfer or to create a regime in which military officers can work with the kind of civilian forces they can expect and accept. And therefore, we should be attentive again to seize this opportunity and to help that process if we can. For now, we only can make sure or tell them that they shouldn't kill people. And, Japan, again, suspended all the talks about new economic aid. And for now, actually not really working on any economic cooperation project. But I wouldn't say that we should be imposing sanctions on Myanmar.
Okay, thank you very much. James, we started receiving questions.
Yes, we have a first question, which takes a quote from Moon Hee-sung, who is the Speaker of the South Korean legislature, who has a quote that says, asking us to choose between our largest security partner, so the United States, and our largest trade partner, so China, is like, quote, asking a child whether you like your dad or your mom, i.e. an impossible choice. It seems that both governments and political parties in Southeast Asia are increasingly divided on trying to balance security and markets. And in some cases, political parties are taking that as a new cleavage. We've seen that in the Philippines, among other countries. Is the choice by governments to try and remain with a degree of neutrality between the US and China sustainable in the long run?
Well, I mean, first of all, let me just remind you that the current Korean government never used the word Indo-Pacific. Their strategy remains for Eurasian bridge. And that means they are not interested in Indo-Pacific and want to be a part of the Quad. And you have to accept it. And I just don't see that to change in the near future or for quite some time, I must say. In the case of Southeast Asian countries, I mean, for example, in the Philippines, you have to be careful to distinguish President Duterte and his economic and security teams. Mr. Duterte says whatever he wants. And that actually is very much entertaining and therefore maintain his support, approval rating among Filipino voters. But if you look at his economic and security teams, economic and security policy, there are a lot of continuity from President Aquino to now. I mean, for example, whatever Mr. Duterte says, US-Philippine security relationship remains very much on solid ground. And if you look at, for example, Malawi, IS battles, as far as I understand, it was Americans and Australians who provided crucial intelligence to Philippine military. So they actually have no doubt about the importance of the alliance with the United States. And also, actually, Japan is strengthening its relationship and security and, of course, economic relations with the Philippines. And you can say something similar to many other countries. They don't want to be confronted by China. And of course, they don't want to be the target of China's hostility like Australia. And therefore, they rather want to be very quiet. Let me give you one example. Recently, about a month ago, Japan and Indonesia organized 2+2 in Tokyo. And they actually agreed, that Japan provide Navy ships to Indonesia for the coming 4 or 5 years. This is first, it's the newest type of frigate ships. But Indonesian government did not want to announce it, simply because they don't want China to actually use this. They, of course, Chinese, of course, know it, but at the same time, Indonesia didn't want to make it clear that they are actually working with Japan on security side. And if you look at, for example, the development of port facilities, all the strategically important ports are being developed by joint ventures between Japan and Indonesia. And the last thing they want will be those projects being developed by Chinese. So, they're quiet, and the last thing they want is, of course, to choose between China and the United States. But they know, what they are doing. And I think, we should understand what they are thinking. And quietly support what they want to do, which are actually good for us too.
Wonderful. We have a question from Grant Road, who's at Boston University. He asks whether you think the developing railway system in Southeast Asia, which has a lot of Chinese involvement, will be increasingly important to Southeast Asia in the coming decades.
That is a
yeah.
Sorry. That is a very important question. Actually, I didn't mention one point which actually I used to emphasize very much, and that is the major difference between mainland Southeast Asia and maritime Southeast Asia, and that is the development of transnational infrastructural development. In mainland Southeast Asia, I mean, as you just said, that China is very keen on developing high-speed trains. They have already built highways, and they are building power grids. But at the same time, if you look at ADB and Japan's development, I mean, Japan's development aid, they are also building infrastructure, but horizontally. So my position is, as long as these mainland Southeast Asia remains open to the world and integrated increasingly into the global economy, that's fine. You know, I mean, for example, highway is highway, whoever built it. And the only thing we need to worry about is some countries are in heavy debt. Laos, clearly is now heavy debt. I mean, we don't know exactly how much, but some actually the estimate shows that that Laotian debt to China is more than 3 times of Laotian GDP. So actually, some countries would be in heavy debt. I mean, are already in heavy debt, and it'll be very difficult for them to say anything which didn't do anything which China doesn't want them to do. But I mean, most of the countries are not that dependent, and they don't want to be too dependent on them, and therefore probably we can do whatever we can. I mean, be pragmatic. That is my position.
Yeah, it seems that in particular questions around high-speed rail and other big infrastructure projects, there seems to be almost contest between Japan, China, and the United States, and who can provide infrastructure to these countries. Indeed, the United States just sort of announced a Blue Dot project, which many are seeing as a response to One Belt, One Road. Do you think that this contest for providing infrastructure on various terms is a good thing for Southeast Asia? Some would argue that competition is good. Others would argue that it's geopolitical rivalry within Southeast Asia.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, my position, is yes, we should offer competition. And actually, I'm openly saying to the public that Japan should offer itself as a leverage, which Southeast Asian countries can use to negotiate with China. I mean, for example, in the case of high-speed train you are talking about in Indonesia, I mean, actually, the original plan for high-speed train from Jakarta to Bandung was designed by Japanese government agency. But at the last minute, the bid went, to China. But over the last 6 years, it hasn't been completed. And when it is completed, most likely it will be, I don't know, how to say it in Japanese. It's a very easy way to make a joke. From Tokyo to, suburban areas, there is a high-speed train, but not Shinkansen, but rather, commuter high-speed train. It will be like that. And Indonesians understand that. And actually, they offered another project to a consortium of Japanese companies to build not exactly high speed, but rather medium speed train system. So actually let them, use Japan as well as the United States and other countries as leverage. And I would rather say that, learning from Japan's failure in obtaining the project for high-speed train in Indonesia, I would say that it will be probably very useful to create a consortium of not just Japanese or American companies, but rather Japanese, American, Australian, and maybe some European companies. So that, substantially there will be a coalition kind of demonstrated in individual projects.
I want to ask about a question with reference to some earlier work that you did with Peter Katzenstein at Oxford, where you talk about different phases of processes, so Americanization, Japanization, Sinicization. It's a question about your views on the cohesiveness of Southeast Asia as a region. You talk a little bit about Islamicization in Indonesia, but do you think there is scope in the future at all for a Southeast Asiaization or an ASEANization of the region?
No, I don't think so. I mean, well, I mean, Sinicization is a very useful concept. And my take, I mean, actually, I would argue that the best way to understand China's OBOR projects in Southeast Asia is in terms of Sinicization. That means, for example, what they are doing in Laos is exactly the same with what they are doing in remote provinces in China. And in that sense, you know, I mean, and even though, I mean, these days, some people, not all, and probably minority of people tend to think OBOR as a big strategic scheme, I frankly don't see that way. You know, I mean, I don't know whether you play Ego or not, but you know, in Ego, you actually put, you know, stones very broadly, and then depending on how you look at these stones, you can see different map. And that's the way Chinese you know, government is playing. I mean, they actually put, you know, I mean, a lot of, you know, projects. And of course, all the state-owned companies need to you know, justify their project to the central government and the party. And therefore, they try to explain what they are doing is exactly in line with the kind of strategic vision which is spelled out by the party and called OBOR. But if you look at individual projects, quite often they don't have much, I mean, connection with the map. And so actually we have to be very realistic, or, you know, I mean, I have to say, I mean, very cool about what they are doing. And actually, if you look at individual projects, and when I was still serving as president of Institute of Developing Economies, I, in fact, you know, I mean, organized a group to examine individual OBOR projects. And then it was quite clear that, you know, I mean, these are informed not by any big strategic picture, but rather individual groups of state corporations and banks, you know, different factions of the party and so on. So we have to be very sort of, you know, careful to look at this project. And it's quite clear many of them are not going well. I wouldn't say 50%, but maybe 25, 30% are not going very well.
We have two questions from the audience. One is on India and the other is on Indonesia. The first question on India is from Keshav Chandra, and they ask, what is the impact of the India-Japan alliance on countries in the Indo-Pacific? And I would add to that also the increasing relationship between India and Taiwan seems to be changing some dynamics in Asia. On Indonesia, we have a question from Aliona Seth, who's at National University of Singapore. They ask, can Indonesia become an outward-looking maritime power as envisioned in the Global Maritime Fulcrum, the GMF? If yes, will we see increasing contestations with China around the South China Sea of the Indian Ocean?
First of all, there is no alliance between India and Japan. India and Japan are strategic partners, and it was mainly built on the personal relationship between Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Modi. And I hope that this, on this foundation, Mr. Suga can build more institutional mechanisms to enhance cooperation, security, as well as economic cooperation with India, but so far I haven't seen much. In the case of Indonesia, yes, President Jokowi talked about maritime Asia, but as I see it, probably he's smart enough to understand that by the time the COVID crisis is over and Indonesian economy is back on track on growth path, his presidency will almost come to an end. And therefore, he is doing what he can do under the current crisis situation. And I don't think that maritime program is one of the most important agenda for him. Certainly, he actually decided to purchase 8 frigates from Japan, and maybe this will be the starter for more important security cooperations. And Indonesia has also revised a number of laws to actually improve their investment climate, and therefore there are good chance for Japanese as well as other companies to invest in Indonesia. But at least for short term, short meaning 2-3 years, I just don't see any sort of expanded effort for Indonesian government to be maritime power. But of course, if you look at their long-term plan, they say that by 2045, they want to be a maritime power. And I very much hope that they will. But, for now, if you look at their defense spending, it's even less than Japan's in terms of GDP, less than 0.8% of Indonesian GDP. And it is far lower than 20 years ago. So they have to do a lot to achieve their maritime power status.
We've spoken a lot about the role of states in the last hour. And you have a very nice framework in your past work of dividing up between states, markets, and society. So I'd like to ask a question that focuses more on the society of Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia has seen increasing urbanization. You've written in the past on its increasingly expanding middle class. And I would add to that also the increasing opportunity that digitization comes to the region. How do these changing dynamics shift how public opinion forms in Southeast Asia, pressures on governments to be more responsive, and how does it change the dynamism in the region?
Yeah, this is a very important question, which frankly, I tend to neglect these days because I'm focused too much on states these days. But certainly, middle class is very important. And when I'm talking about, for example, Thailand, Thai politics, or Myanmar politics, I'm basically looking at sort of highly educated, young, middle-class kids, in their teens and 20s. And they're pretty well Americanized or globalized. Most of them are bilingual, and they understand, they communicate in English with their counterparts in other countries. And that is where this, what is called Milk Tea Alliance was created. And therefore, this kind of, emergence of new, highly educated, young, middle-class people should always be kept in mind because they will be in the position to make a very important bearing on their politics. But at the same time, if you look at, for example, Indonesia, and you can also say the same thing about other countries, digitalization actually is making it possible for something which you also experience. That means, digitalization actually were quite instrumental in disseminating whatever you call it, false news or fake news or whatever. And actually, for example, Islamists, very sort of radical Islamists in Indonesia are thriving on this. And therefore, you have to be very careful that, that this digitalization has both sides. Pluses and minuses. And certainly, I would never underestimate the importance of digitalization for radical Islamism.
Can I jump in, James?
Yeah.
Yeah. I also found your discussion about middle classes, rising middle classes, and also the kind of mass politicization, like politicization of masses, very interesting in the book. And I was wondering what you think about kind of what type of democratization we might see in the region, because will it be a liberal democracy, which is kind of maybe not very likely. So, what is the tide of the times in this regard? And a more practical question: you mentioned the desirability of consortia of Japanese, American, Australian, European companies on infrastructure projects. What about the kind of consortia with Chinese companies, provided the standards are upheld and quality infrastructure and all that? Maybe in some areas like climate change related areas, renewables related. So what's your take on that?
Well, I mean, let me first respond to the second question. It is up to them, as a matter of fact. I mean, for example, when China decided and called on the world to establish AIIB, I mean, Japan and the United States did not join. At the same time, Mr. Abe announced that if AIIB's projects meet several conditions, then Japanese government is happy to work with China on AIIB projects. So, I mean, it depends. And certainly, I mean, actually, I'm now serving as chair of Japan's Energy Policy Council. And I certainly welcome that, to achieving the carbon neutrality by 2050, we need China to be part of this effort. And about democratization, yes, you're right. I mean, actually, we certainly shouldn't set the expectation too high. But I would say that whether you have elections, especially reasonably fair and free elections, or non-election, then I would rather prefer a system in which at least some kind of reasonably fair and free elections are held, even though the government tend to be very majoritarian, and all the countries' systems are now. But at the same time, actually, there is somewhere in the middle which we should be happier with.
Wonderful. We are almost at time. I would like to take the opportunity to say thank you very much to Professor Takashi Shiraishi, and as well to thank our audience for their questions. I'd like to thank our event coordinators, Danielle Woolner and Penny Skalnick, who, along with Nargis Casanova, do a fantastic job of bringing these events to you from the Davis Center. And I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, who are the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, the Program on US-Japan Relations here at the Weatherhead Center at Harvard University, the Reischauer Institute for Japanese Studies, and the Harvard University Asia Center for all lending their support to today's event. We will reconvene in, I believe, the fall semester, so stay tuned for more information about future events. And thank you very much to Professor Takashi Shiraishi.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. Bye.
Thank you so much.